Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of IHR TV. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our time. Sea level rise, drought, extreme weather events, and water scarcity pose a threat to communities' livelihoods and oblige people to flee their homes. But do the so-called climate refugees legally exist? Are they recognized by international law? Here with us today is Kaylee Ober, who is the Senior Advocate and Program Manager of the Climate Displacement Program for Refugees International. Kaylee Ober, thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
Kaylee, how many people have migrated or are internally displaced due to extreme weather conditions, natural disasters, and climate change?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, mostly because climate change presents itself in a variety of ways. And while it can impact one's decision to migrate, it's very hard to disentangle to what degree someone chooses to migrate because of climate change. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center does a very good job of doing some ex post facto calculations of people who are displaced due to extreme weather. And so IDMC calculated in 2019 that at least 24 million people were displaced due to extreme weather, more than double those of displaced by conflict.
Those who have migrated or are internally displaced due to disasters and climate change are, let's say, disadvantaged from a legal point of view because of terminology issues. We often hear the media and the general public refer to them by using the term climate refugees, but this term doesn't exist. International law doesn't recognize the term climate refugees, does it?
Climate refugees as a legal term does not exist, although it's very popular in the media and to the general public. I think because it does convey a sense of urgency and people are familiar with the term refugee. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to say someone is a refugee due to climate change because of issues of attribution and causation. And also because of the 1951 Refugee Convention and how narrow in scope it's designed to be.
What is considered a refugee under the Refugee Convention 1951?
Essentially covering people who are crossing over borders that are fleeing violence and persecution. It's actually just legally inaccurate to say someone's a climate refugee because it doesn't fit within this scope of the existing refugee definition.
What implication does the non-recognition of the term climate refugees have?
So the 1951 Refugee Convention is globally recognized. It's a very strong international accord comparatively to others, and most nation states follow it. Honestly, it's one of the strongest protection mechanisms we have when it comes to those who are crossing over borders. It affords a person moving and applying for asylum a much broader scope of rights than under any other mechanism that might exist. And so when climate change is not acknowledged in such a global accord, it's harder to afford the same type of protection to those who might be moving for reasons due to climate change, related to climate change. And so they essentially fall through the cracks of international legal definitions in asylum law.
Refugees International was among the first organizations to call on addressing the increasing impact of climate change on displacement and migration. Do you think that the definition of refugee needs to be readapted as the world is living one of the biggest challenges of our time?
I think much more likely is that we'll have something that is piecemeal version of a refugee convention, maybe in a regional context where different regional entities will be able to create their own definitions and be able to protect those being displaced due to climate change in a more regional context.
Do you see this happening soon?
Interestingly, I think that we've made a lot of progress in certain regions, in particular Latin America and the Caribbean, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. There are different ways in which different regions are putting together different types of law or protocols in which it would afford more protection to people displaced due to climate change. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, I think some of that progress has stalled. We're in the throes of a lot of border closures, restricted travel, and I think that unfortunately has bled into states thinking about freedom of movement as a detriment to their population rather than as a benefit.
Even though the term climate refugees is not recognized by international law, a landmark ruling by the UN Human Rights Committee in January 2020 could turn the tide. Tell me more about this ruling and its outcome.
There was this man from Kiribati who applied for asylum due to climate change in New Zealand. New Zealand rejected his application, obviously because the 1951 Refugee Convention is very narrow. He decided to go to the UN Human Rights Committee to appeal that decision under a different international human rights treaty, and saying, essentially forcing him to move back to his homeland, which he considered to be, a hard life, would remove dignity from his life. So the UN Human Rights Committee ruled that although they agreed with New Zealand, he shouldn't be considered a climate refugee, and they did not believe sending him back home to Kiribati was a threat to his life. Tellingly, they did say in maybe 10 to 15 years they should revisit the question, because maybe in 10 to 15 years it will be uninhabitable due to climate change, particularly sea level rise. And if that's the case, then, a better case could be made that someone should not be forced to move back home when their home is so affected by climate change. So it laid the groundwork or the foundation for someone to be able to appeal decisions in the future.
What could potentially be the implications of this ruling, and will this ruling allow lawyers to open a path for those directly affected by climate change?
Essentially, having that one bit of text about 10 to 15 years in the future, we could argue about if someone could be, displaced due to climate change, helps lawyers and legal teams put together a good case that maybe makes the case better than what this Kiribati man did. I think that's a positive step. But we also need to remember that this ruling is under a very specific human rights treaty, which is non-binding, and not every state has signed on to, including the United States. So although there is some hope, we have to be realistic about the reality of the situation and the current political economy of the world.
In December 2018, the UN General Assembly adopted the Global Compact on Refugees, recognizing that climate, environmental degradation, and natural disasters increasingly interact with the drivers of the refugee movement. Despite the fact that this is not legally binding, this is the first ever UN global agreement on a common approach to international migration in all its dimensions. How has it changed international response to this issue?
I think it was a positive step for something that at the global level, like the Global Compact for Refugees, to acknowledge that climate change may be a cause for displacement. Normatively, that's a positive step forward. I think it hasn't really changed much when it comes to refugee law or asylum policy. I think it does give scope for certain international actors to be more involved with climate change related programs and planning. So, for instance, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has become more actively engaged on issues of climate change. And I think they will continue to do so.
Research on how destination states have used refugee law to protect people crossing borders because of natural disasters and climate change is very limited, according to UNHCR. What role does refugee law play in this area?
People are going across borders due to disaster, with or without an existing law in place that allows them to do so or affords them protection. So the Refugee Convention doesn't necessarily extend protections to those who are crossing over borders. However, there's other initiatives or other mechanisms that different nation states can turn to. So, for instance, the Platform on Disaster Displacement is working on the ground in different regions to put together different types of soft law, cobble together different laws that exist to essentially create protections for those who are displaced due to climate change that cross borders. The Refugee Convention also shows us what can be done within a legal scope if we get a little bit more imaginative and creative. And so you have certain states that have things like humanitarian visas, which also extend protections to those who are displaced by disaster. So, for example, Brazil, they have offered humanitarian visas to both Haitians and Syrians who have been displaced by, in the case of the Haitians, earthquakes, in the case of Syrians, the Syrian civil war, which is related to climate change. And so we get a better understanding of the different types of mechanisms that may be able to exist, and we can compare it to the Refugee Convention. And that's how it serves its purpose.
You authored the World Bank's flagship report, Groundswell: Preparing for Internal Climate Migration, which focuses on slow onset climate impacts on the internal migration in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. You found that by 2050, as many as 143 million people might be forced to move from increasingly non-viable areas of their countries. What are the steps to be taken in those regions and globally to prevent a potential crisis?
So Groundswell was one of the first reports of its kind to take this kind of scenario approach to projecting how many people might move due to climate change. And I think there's some important things to underscore or highlight from the report. One is it's based on different scenarios. So the 143 million people number is actually kind of a midpoint. It's not the most extreme and it's not the least number. The scenarios demonstrate that if you invest in more friendly development policies, sustainable development policies, if you mitigate more emissions, those who will be forced to migrate due to climate change will drop precipitously. We're at a crossroads, and the decisions we make now, policy decisions we make now will really determine to what extent people will be displaced or moved due to climate change. We also need to plan for the fact that climate migration will happen regardless how much emissions we cut, because we've already baked in a certain amount of emissions into our environment. And so people will have to move. So realistically, what this means is we have to plan for rural to urban migration, which is by and large the biggest trend line when it comes to different types of future migration, especially related to climate change. And so we need to invest in cities, especially peri-urban areas. We need to invest in social mobile protection, so ensuring that social protection that is provided to those who are migrating moves with them. It doesn't just stop as soon as they leave their home village. And these are very no risk, high reward things that we can do, that we should be doing, whether or not 143 million people migrate due to climate change or less or more.
Katie Ober, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Margherita.
And thank you for being with us for another episode of IHR TV. From myself, Margherita Cargasacchi, until next time, goodbye.